Basic Brewing Radio is brought to you by the American Homebrewers Association, who invite you to celebrate Mead Month this August. For a limited time, the American Homebrewers Association is offering a free copy of Ken Schramm's book, The Complete Mead Maker, to joining and renewing members. Visit homebrewersassociation.org/mead for details. That's homebrewersassociation.org/mead. Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, August 12th, 2021. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week, Dr. Matt Winans, R&D scientist for Imperial Organic Yeast, answers your questions about the science of Kveik. How do these farmhouse yeast strains work so hard, so fast, and so well? If you go to basicbrewing.com, you can find archives of our audio and video shows. If you go to basicbrewingshop.com, you can find our DVDs and our brewer's logbooks. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Basic Brewing and find our show page on Facebook as well. If you want to support us financially, check out patreon.com/basicbrewing. And thanks to everybody who's helping out in that way. If you go to patreon.com/basicbrewing, you can see a long list of stuff that you can access if you sign up as a supporter. Financial supporters have already seen the video about my Hot Porch New England IPA, fermented very warm on my front porch with Imperial's Bartleby Kveik strain. I don't know. To be honest, I don't know if I would, if it would technically fit into the NEPA category if I were to submit it to a competition. But it was plenty juicy and delicious. For my purposes, the general public will see that video on Friday. Steve's been brewing up a storm lately, so I have a feeling there will be a bunch of Steve brewed episodes coming up, and I can't wait to taste what he's got going on. Let's take a look into the mailbag. Nick from Pelican Rapids, Minnesota writes, well, I just listened to the latest podcast, and oh great, another mead episode with Steve. Every time you do a mead show with Steve, I think to myself, Steve makes it sound so easy, and I bet it's fantastic. It is. So I go out and buy $50 in honey, add water, yeast, and nutrients, and get a hot mess in return. Nick says, well, gotta run and get more honey. Well, I hope that hot mess turns out well, Nick, and not an entry into the annual disaster show. Mead must is sticky, you gotta say. Then there's this from Tom Brennan. I was wondering if you or maybe Steve can help me out with this one. I've been making a variation of your fruitcake barley wine every year for the past 6 or 7 years now. Wow, you've made more than I have. Tom says, you may remember I sent you a version and you drank it during a disaster show a few weeks back. Speaking of the disaster show, yeah. Thanks, Tom. Again, I appreciate your sending that. Anyway, he says, this year I plan on doing a dual brew by making the barley wine while also making a mead version of the beer. I'll be using the same Kveik yeast on both and adding rum-soaked cherries to the beer before I package. I'll be taking the cherries and putting it with the mead when I transfer to a secondary. Tom asks, when should I add the spice bomb to the mead? Would it be best to add it when I first mix the must or to secondary? When I first replied to Tom, I suggested maybe heating the spices up a bit might unlock and awaken their flavors and aromas. Not enough to boil off volatile compounds, but, just enough to kind of release those things. But now, the more I think about it, I'm thinking adding the spices using a tincture might be the answer. So soaking the spices in a neutral spirit and then adding that to the mead, maybe in the bottling bucket so you can control the amount of spice character. You can measure, drop by drop how much of that tincture, that spice tincture that you put in there. And that way it takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. But those sound like fun batches, and I hope that Tom keeps us updated. Speaking of mead, let's have a quick word from our friends and sponsors, Ricky and Kelly from Groenfell and Havoc Meaderies. Rumble, the first in the Sour Mead series, was released a year ago, as I've been talking about, and to celebrate, they're doing a limited re-release. And if you go to Groenfell.com right now, you can find Rumble is shipping as we speak. Rumble is brewed with honey from Champlain Valley apiaries in Vermont, along with pure blueberry and blackberry juice and a blend of sour yeast strains. And that's not all for you sour mead fans out there. There's a sour mead case, which includes 8 cans of Mead-A-Readaville, which is a pineapple, orange, and lime mead, Sour Mead Maker, which is a raspberry lime Ricky mead, and Psychopomp, a cherry mead. That just sounds like a lot of fun in the summertime. Check them all out along with other way delicious craft meads and honey beverages at family-owned and operated Groenfell.com. That's GROENNFELL. Okay, this latest beer that I brewed with Kveik out on the porch, it just really fascinated me. The way that Bartleby yeast kicked up so fast and hard in that warm temperature, it got me wondering what's going on, from the science side of things. So I asked Casey up at Imperial Yeast if she could connect me with an expert to shed some light on the subject. Dr. Matt Winans, welcome to Basic Brewing Radio.
Hi, thanks, James. I appreciate you having me on today.
Well, the reason I'm having you on, and I have to thank Casey up there at Imperial for getting us together. But the reason I'm talking to you today is I recently brewed a batch of beer with Bartleby, which is a Hornindal strain, as I understand, and I fermented it out on my hot porch. It's in the 90s down here, and that sucker, it was a 1070 beer, and after I pitched that pouch of yeast, within 2 hours, the airlock was bubbling. And like 8 or 9 hours later, it was like the most active airlock I think I've ever seen in my life. The CO2 was just pumping out of the thing. And the beer turned out delicious. And so it got me wondering, I wanted to look under the hood of, these Kveik strains and kind of check and see what's going on. Why do they work like this and how do they work so well? And I'm hoping that you can help us out on that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good to know that the Bartleby strain was really pumping like a steam engine there for you and made some good beer. And as far as getting underneath the hood, we can take a look at some of the research that's been done on it, and happy to talk about that and get as nerdy as we can get.
Sounds great. So what's your role there at Imperial?
So I do research and development here. We recently got into a new building and have a brand new lab space. So I do the research and development. I do a lot of lab work, and I also do some of the educational outreach. So happy to be here. I've been here for just under 2 years or so, and it's been great. Everyone here is very friendly and thirsty for beer and knowledge, which are two of my favorite things about people. So it's been great.
What's your experience with Kveik?
So I started working with Kveiks right when I started at Imperial, and we've been digging into them a little bit more recently than we had in the past. But I really started working with yeast during my PhD at West Virginia University, and it's kind of interesting. I went out to Japan and worked with some sake brewers out there, and we made some hybrids for sake out there. And we used other Saccharomyces species other than Saccharomyces cerevisiae, specifically Saccharomyces arbicola. And, with the other hybrids with species other than Saccharomyces cerevisiae, you get a lot of cold tolerance. So these Kveik strains are super interesting in that they kind of went completely in the other direction and are very hot tolerant.
Yeah, it's amazing. I opened up the topic to social media on Twitter and Facebook and got some questions. One of the first questions, and I think we might have been answering it by talking about the topic, but at Jeff Covey says, "What is the proper pronunciation of Kveik?" That seems every time I talk about this, people ask.
Right. It's a weird word in the English language, at least for us Americans. But looking at literature, it's pronounced like Kveik, but with a K in front of it. So kind of comes out Kveik. Um, but I'll do my best to keep it to that proper pronunciation the best I can. Also, from what I understand, that's kind of a regional dialect, mostly from the Voss region, so right around Western Norway. And I think they kind of use different words for yeast in different areas of Norway as well. I mean, it's all dialect based, and if we're going to focus on the word Kveik, the word actually has, I think, combined by two parts. So the first one is the word that means yeast, and then the second one is kind of like to bring new life into something.
Hmm.
So that's the Kveik word.
Well, there you go. I got more of an answer out of that than I thought I would. There are no stupid questions, I guess is the.
I don't think there are any stupid questions. As long as someone learns from whatever question they have, it's not stupid. That's one of my favorite things, actually, about talking with homebrewers, anyone in the brewing industry. They have a lot of questions, and it's really interesting to hear all the perspectives.
Now, if listeners haven't heard the episodes with Lars Marius Garshol and Mika Leitinen, the authors who have written on this topic and about other beers in that region of the world, and Scandinavia and Western Europe and places like that, go back and listen to those episodes and read their books, because they're amazing. So we have to acknowledge them. Eric Brooks from Facebook asks, is all Kveik from a single strain and then mixed with other non-Kveik strains for distinctive properties, or are there multiple distinct Kveik yeasts? In other words, what's the taxonomy of all the different Kveik strains that we're seeing out there on the market today?
The taxonomy is pretty complicated. If you read Lars's book, it kind of goes into details, and of course he has the blog online. But in general, you will hear a yeast strain refer to a region, or when they get that farmhouse, like let's say like a Voss or a Loki strain, it first collected contains anywhere from like 2 to over 10 strains. And some of them are closely related. But today, what we usually do as industrial yeast manufacturers is we kind of specialize in reductionism, and we'll isolate the best strain, and that's the single strain that you get most of the time. You know, we do have a A44 Kveiking, which is a blend of 3 different strains. So it's more kind of along the way of what a traditional, I guess, farmhouse brew would use, where it has multiple strains.
Yeah, I mean, back to the roots of where this comes from. I mean, these are farmhouse yeasts, or farmhouse, or groups of organisms that have been passed down maybe from generations to generation. And some of the stories that I've heard about these, they're collected on these wooden Kveik rings, and they're hung up in the barn to dry. And and sometimes brewers will knock the bird poop off of it before they use it. And
right. I mean, it is very farmhousey, and that's one of the most interesting parts of it. And I also read, like, in addition to that, every 5, maybe 10 years or so, what some of the people would do is they would also mix in other cultures. So they would get another culture from their neighbor or something like that to keep the Kveik vigorous. And so reading more into that, it turns out that if you kind of let it go without introducing, some other cultures into it, it kind of becomes inbred over time. So it was a way that they would keep their culture strong.
Sonasa David on Twitter says, how do you grow your strains different from others? As an example, Hornindal from Omega and the Imperial Bartleby, are they actually different? So is in the process of your selecting these different strains, could your version be different from another company's?
Yeah, I mean, they could be different, but like I was saying earlier, with different samples from the farmhouse breweries, there's usually, 2 to 10 strains within a sample, and a lot of these are banked at national culture collection areas. So you can order these, let's say if you're a yeast manufacturer, but we have done studies here where we compare, let's say, ours to another manufacturers and can say, these ferment the same. So yeah, and ours, Bartleby, would ferment the same as the other one mentioned.
And how is the yeast able to function so well at these high temperatures? I mean, I'm assuming that I've never done it, but I'm assuming that if I took the Chico strain and treated it as badly as as I did this one, pitching it into a 98 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius wort and leaving it out on my hot porch, I'm assuming that I wouldn't get the same delicious beer from that. So what's going on in the mechanics of these yeasts that they're able to work so well and so quickly with so few off flavors at those high temperatures?
Yeah, it's really fascinating because I've done that early on in brewing where you ferment a little bit too hot and it doesn't quite produce the best flavors. But if we look back at the literature, we can see that there's loss of function mutations associated with thermotolerance in these Kveik strains. And there's I have to go back and look, but about 6 or so that have been completely sequenced for their genome. And, a lot of these loss of function mutations relevant to thermotolerance have to do with like cell wall proteases or cell wall related mechanisms. And we can get into the individual genes. I think an example that I saw was LRC1 or KEX1. Those are some. But again, they're related to the cell wall. And that's one of the reasons that they're able to have higher thermotolerance.
So specifically, what about it? When you say loss of function, that doesn't sound like a good thing.
Usually it's not, but it also depends on what the attribute is. For instance, the phenolic off flavor, if it's positive for that, and if it has the functional gene, then it produces that phenolic off flavor, which for breweries, that's not something that we want. So a loss of function mutation in the POF gene is actually beneficial for breweries.
Oh, okay. So there's a gene that produces that phenolic off flavor that is turned off, maybe in the Kveik strains.
That's right, and that's true. So one of the hallmarks of domestication, at least for brewing yeast, is not being POF positive, and these are not. And the loss of function mutation here involved with the cell wall actually is positive for brewers that want to ferment hotter as well here.
And do they accomplish this quick fermentation? Is part of it rapid replication? I mean, are there more yeast cells being manufactured in a typical Kveik fermentation than in normal beer yeast fermentation?
We haven't seen any evidence of that because our pitch rates are the same for the Kveiks as they are all of our other yeast strains. But if you dive into the genome, the thermotolerance, so the heat tolerance there, is key. And then also, if you look at ethanol production, there are several mutations, and this is what we would call SNPs, and that's SNP, so single nucleotide polymorphisms. So there's SNPs and some ethanol production related genes. Some examples are like AGP2, PCA1, USP70, and if people are interested in some of these genes specifically, a great resource to dive into them is sgd.com, which stands for the Saccharomyces Genome Database. And you can find a lot of research, a lot of literature, and a lot of just really great detailed information that is relevant to Saccharomyces genome.
Michael Doman on Facebook says, do you need to do a diacetyl rest when fermenting Kveik at a high temperature, or can you cold crash it as soon as the activity stops? So do these mutations, does that affect the production of diacetyl as well?
From all the literature I've read in our experience here, there's nothing to suggest that you don't have to do a diacetyl rest. If you're brewing a beer and you want to know if the diacetyl is still present, the precursors are there, you should just do the VDK test. It's super easy for homebrewers to do. And we have some YouTube videos up that we posted not too long ago that goes into detail about how to do that. But, since these ferment so quick and they ferment hot, that diacetyl rest could actually happen, but it happens so quick that we don't see it. So the best advice would be to, if you're unsure, do a VDK test, and then if it's not present there, it's good to crash.
Yeah, typically when you do a diacetyl rest, you raise the temperature of your fermentation a little bit to to let the yeast clean up, but it seems like
Right.
it's already hot.
It is, and some of them are incredibly hot. Like, we're talking 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yeah, yeah. I think the stuff on my porch, it must have gotten over that, during that intense fermentation.
Sure, yeah, and the yeast even produce their own heat inside the fermentation vessel too. So just because it's 90 degrees outside, it could be 92, 95 inside in the core there.
Jack the Ginger on Twitter says, I've read that generally speaking, Kveik beers tend to ferment at a lower pH than most other yeasts, which can accentuate dryness, bitterness, and provide a citrusy character. Sometimes this is desirable, but sometimes it's not, depending on the beer style. So my question is, can these impacts be mitigated by targeting a higher match pH, such as 5.5, rather than the more common 5.2 or 5.3? And I'm assuming that's maybe in the mash or in the wort. Thanks and cheers. So what role does pH play in this?
Well, cheers to you, Jack the Ginger. That one's a lot to unpack there. So as far as pH goes in the mash, that 5.2 to 5.3 is going to be really your sweet spot. And the whole idea of your mash, as I'm sure a lot of you guys know, is that you want to convert all those carbohydrates to sugars. And so the temperature and your pH are going to really help you out with that. It kind of sounds more like a buffering capacity of the wort to me, to keep the pH in check. So if you want to kind of get, I guess, not quite a dry of a beer when you're done, maybe you do a higher temp of the mash, and that will leave some of that residual sweetness that can, that would help mitigate over dryness of the beer.
The High Gravity Basic Brewing discount is back. If you go to highgravitybrew.com and purchase a Warthog electric system or controller and use the code EBC75BB, you'll save $75 off your purchase. And to find out the wide range of Warthog products eligible for the discount, head on over to basicbrewing.com and click on the High Gravity Basic Brewing Code Deals link. It's a little graphic on the right-hand side of the page. EBC75BB is good on the Build Your Own Brewing System page, Warthog Brew in a Bag, 2-vessel and 3-vessel systems, and the standalone Warthog controllers. And if you want to build your own system out of gear you already have, you can get you a controller for $75 off. Take the pain out of propane for $75 off Warthog products at highgravitybrew.com using the code EBC75BB at highgravitybrew.com. It's highgravitybrew.com. Bob Givens says, how do you propagate and maintain Kveik for long-term results without introducing a wild mutation? Do the same rules apply for these Kveik strains as sort of normal beer yeasts?
Yeah, so the same rules apply as far as keeping them stored. If you don't want them to evolve or you don't want any mutations, the very best way is the way that we do it here, and that involves having a negative 80 degrees Celsius freezer. But if we're speaking practically, the best way to do it would be to keep it in your fridge, kind of like what they do now. You can dry it, of course, like James mentioned earlier in the show. They had Kveik rings. They also had Kveik logs, which I think were called Kveik stocks, maybe. So you can do it a number of ways. If you want to emulate the way that we do it, you could potentially freeze some in your just regular home freezer if you wanted to do it that way, and then go back to that and propagate that up. It involves a little bit more work, but you could do it. And if you do try, I would sterilize some glycerol, and I would use that as a sugar source for them while they're in the freezer. It will help them not go through fermentation while they're in the freezer. To use glycerol, they have to use cellular respiration, which is going to help with preventing the mutations.
And I've seen some websites and videos of people doing kind of a more traditional approach, and spreading the slurry of Kveik out on say some paper or something, and drying it out, and sort of flaking that dried slurry, and storing it in a dried place, in a dry way. But doing that, coming from a lab background, that's not necessarily the most sterile way to do things.
No, it's not. I mean, can it be done? Sure, it can be done. And that's the way that a lot of people had done it before. And I've seen people use like cloths as well. So you can do it on that. If the best way to keep that sterile would be under like a biosafety hood where it's like HEPA filtered. It's kind of relevant to fermentation. If you do that, to pitch it in there when it's hot, kind of keeping in line with the traditional brewing style, and then you're going to ferment it really quickly. Because eventually, even if it has some contamination, if you ferment it fast and then you drink it quickly, there's a chance that it might not catch up if your pitch rate for your Saccharomyces Kveik strains are high enough. Mm-hmm. Of course, I work at a yeast lab, and we do that stuff and we take a lot of pride in our QC here. So if you do try it, I would suggest always keeping a backup in your refrigerator. If it goes, let's say off the deep end, you can always order more from us. Yeah, I encourage people to try new things, but if you need another one, we're here for you too. So.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, in the farmhouse breweries, they don't have hoods and
nope. And they have rafters and their farmhoses and
bird poop.
And like you mentioned, birds.
And you have a point with it, pitching it in warm, so that the good strains have the potential to outcompete the other organisms that are, whatever's on that ring, or, in the dried flakes or whatever. But then also in talking to Lars Marius and Mika, especially like when you talk about sati and things like that, those are meant to be drunk or consumed fresh, because they will sour over time. Mm-hmm. So there's other stuff going on in there that, may take a little longer to take hold.
Yes.
So, that's kind of one of the dangers of being kind of less meticulous, I guess, about your sanitization.
Sure. Yeah. It's a perishable product. And, some of those, I want to say other microorganisms in there, they do add a complexity and a deepness to it. So, it's a love-hate and a give and take relationship there.
At Homebrew and Vinyl on Twitter says, if I buy a pouch of Kveik from Imperial and want to save some yeast for a future brew, am I best to pour some into distilled water or wort and keep it refrigerated like, quote, normal yeast, or pour a little onto a greaseproof paper and let it dry and store it as dry flakes? I guess we covered that. But
we did.
Could you use distilled water to kind of be a buffer or be a storage medium?
You could. I've done it, but it's really only best for short term because the distilled water doesn't have any ions in there. And so when the yeast are in the water, they're going to try their best to keep an equilibrium to their external environment and their internal. I mean, yeast are very hardy and their cell wall is very hardy as well. So they would live a little bit, but the best thing is you want to give them some nutrients for storage. So what would be better than distilled water, in my opinion?
And this is, it's natural selection it's a demonstration of natural selection because they're using the yeasts and they keep the ones that work and they throw away the ones that don't.
Yeah, and that's actually what, in my opinion, has a lot to do with the evolution of these Kveik strains. Depending on the region, it mattered how good the crop was from the previous year. Because if you didn't have a very good crop, then you didn't brew a whole lot. And then your yeast strains had to be dried more because, the frequency, as we probably know here, it depends on how you store your yeast. If you're brewing really frequently and you want to reuse your yeast, store it in liquid and reuse it within a week or so is best practice. But if you're going to brew maybe 2-4 times a year, that's when the drying on the rings and on those logs, really became relevant. So also your brew schedule matters as far as how you're going to store and reuse them.
Johnny Sullivan on Facebook says, do the Kveik strains need more nutrient additions than typical yeast?
No, not that we've seen. Your typical yeast nutrient will help them. And again, wort has sufficient yeast nutrients in there. You can always buffer it a little bit more with zinc, or if you want to get some yeast nutrient from us that has zinc and some other things in there that will help. But you can treat them the same as far as nutrient goes with other yeast.
Will Allward says, do you recommend fermenting with Kveik under pressure, 10 to 15 psi? Why or why not?
I've seen people do that. I've heard a lot of people call in here and ask about that with the homebrewers thing. I personally don't do it. I think the Kveiks make a great product as is. And I think the idea behind this from talking with people is that they ferment a little bit faster, and it might be relevant on like a really large scale, but for a home brewer, I don't know if it's worth all that work.
Sean Lager says, why does Kveik stop attenuation at normalish points with beer, but chew on down to 0.000 or more with cider?
Well, I would have to believe that it has to do with the carbohydrate or the sugar composition of whatever you may be fermenting. And so with the ciders, I guess it's more it's an easier carbohydrate to chew through. And if we're getting onto the science of the Kveiks and fermenting sugars, there's a lot of copy number variations in the genes related to maltose and maltotriose transport. So that's another way that the Kveiks are unique. And the copy number variation is it's kind of self-explanatory, but we're talking about genes here, and so it's a gene that has a higher or lower copy number in reference to the reference Saccharomyces genome, which is S288C. It's a lab strain.
Yeah, it's just maybe that the ciders are more fermentable.
Yeah.
Just there's more stuff to eat.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mocha Porter on Twitter says, is it likely that similar behaving yeasts still exist uncaptured in nature, or are those strictly native to northern Eurasia and adapted to breaking down maltotriose, etc., through many generations of use? And do they have uses in other applications besides beer making? We've here in the United States, just a few years ago, it was said that, you couldn't do a lambic beer, quote unquote, spontaneously fermented lambic beers because those yeasts only existed in the air in Belgium, Mm-hmm. So there've got to be like wild yeasts, undomesticated yeasts all over the world that can do all kinds of amazing stuff, right?
Absolutely. I really like this question. So Mocha Porter, thanks for answering this. And now it's got a couple different parts, so I'm going to try to unpack them, I guess, in the order that they were asked. So the first part, is it likely that similar behaving yeast exist still uncaptured in nature? Absolutely. That's one of my favorite things to speculate about. During grad school, we went around on a trip one time, and we hiked. A friend of mine, we hiked the Appalachian Trail, and we captured a bunch of wild yeast from the Appalachian Trail on different flowers. And he was really good at botany, so we are able to identify the flowers and what yeast strains were on them. So there's also a big push globally to find more yeast strains. And I think since 2008, there's been several yeast species actually identified. Saccharomyces arboricola, the one that I studied in Japan, is one of them. And I think the most recent one is Saccharomyces urei, which was discovered in the mountains of France, I believe. So as far as yeast species and yeast strains, I think there's a whole lot out there that is uncaptured, and it leaves a lot to be explored. There's a theory going around that I like to dig into sometimes, that it's an out of Asia theory, and the kind of main idea behind this is, where did yeast originate? And a lot of it is seen in Asia because of the diversity there. There's a lot of diversity of yeast there, and there's a similar theory going around for how humans evolved, excuse me, and that's out of Africa theory. So there's a lot left out there, and we're always looking for new strains, and happy to take a look at anyone who's interested in traveling with me to capture new yeast. So the second part is, are they adapted to breaking down maltotriose through generations of use? Now, I touched on that briefly with the copy number variations and genes related to maltose and maltotriose transport. So they are adapted to fermenting malt. And the last part here, do they have uses in other applications beside beer making? Sure. I mean, the uses are kind of dependent on the creator. So you could absolutely make it for cider, as someone else mentioned. You could use it in the traditional sense for making bread. But if you go into things such as, I don't know, GMO, or maybe like a probiotic, potentially, but I don't think the research is there to say definitively not where it could be used. So more to come on that in the future, I hope.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if you could make bread faster with,
right.
If it works so quickly at warmer temperatures, you could have a loaf rise in a fraction of the time.
Yeah. And one of the things too I kind of touched on earlier is that they had kind of kept these Kveik strains, or the cultures, vigorous by mixing in other cultures every 5 to 10 years. And so there's a lot of hybridization events within the Saccharomyces cerevisiae species in there. And a recent paper took the genes and did a full genome sequencing on I think maybe 6 Kveik strains, and they put it in a classic Galone, I think 2016 paper that sequenced a bunch of strains and grouped them in the beer 1 and beer 2 clades. One of the most interesting things about that paper, at least to me, is that they found that it was more than a diploid. All these Kveik strains were more than a diploid. At least, I don't want to say all, but a lot of them were more than 2N, means that they have more than the regular amount of chromosome copies. Like you and I, humans, we have 1 chromosome from our mom, 1 chromosome from our dad. That makes us 2N. These have 3, 4N, and that's a kind of a commonplace in some lager brewings where they're interspecific hybrids. So yeah, one of the genome copies was from, I guess it aligned closely with the beer 1 clade, which is the U.S. and Britain and the German beers. And then the other one was a more basal strain, which kind of aligned more with the Asian ones. Kind of wild, but so it's the combination of those 2 genomes together and the hybridization events, which really is interesting. And I think that's where we're going to find some future research. I think that's where we're going to find some of the more finer details about what makes these Kveik strains tick.
Let's take a quick break to talk about our friends and sponsors at Tavour. If you listen to this show, you know about Tavour. It's a way to select delicious craft beers that you may not be able to find in your area and have them delivered to you. It's not a Beer of the Month club where someone chooses beer for you, and it's kind of a surprise when it comes to your door. You only pay for the beer that you choose over the course of the month. Signing up for Tavour is free. Just create an account at Tavour.com. That's T-A-V as in Victor, O-U-R.com. Download their iPhone or Android app and you'll receive notifications for 2 new beers each day that are available for purchase with in-depth tasting notes from Philip at Tavour. This month, look for Newtopia Cider, Radiant Beer Company, Great South Bay, Streetside Brewery, Arclight Brewing, and Unseen Creatures. If you're not interested in the beers you see, no worries. Just skip the ones you don't want. However, when you see something that you do, and you will, just click on it and add it to your crate. Your beer arrives fresh every few weeks, allowing you enough time to fill a box and pay the least shipping. Why don't you check it out? It doesn't cost anything to sign up, and there's no obligation to purchase anything. In fact, if I can ask you a favor, go to Tavour.com, T-A-V as in Victor, O-U-R.com, or download the app, and when you sign up, enter the promo code BASIC BREWING, that's all one word, and you'll get $10 off your first shipment of $25 or more. Again, it's free to sign up, and there's no obligation to purchase. Sign up at Tavour.com or with the Tavour app and enter BASIC BREWING as the promo code. Boozer Backyard on Twitter says there's a lot of talk about some Kveik strains producing lager-like beers with low esters really quickly at higher than usual temps. Given the tricks macro producers already use to pump out lager-like beer cheaply, do you think any of them will be looking at Kveik strains? So in your customer list, do you have professional breweries, commercial breweries that are brewing, lager-like beers at higher temperatures?
I'm sure we do. We have a lot of different people that are trying a lot of different things, and especially with some Kveik ones, they're kind of pushing the limits of what what modern craft brewers are doing. But if we're talking about like the macro brewers out there, the really big names, I'm not really sure if they would switch over to the Kveiks just because they ferment faster and quickly. They kind of built all, really, really large brews and brand names around the yeast that they use. So I don't see that happening. I could see some craft brewers really pushing the boundaries, though.
Yeah, this leads to the question from Mike Fours on Facebook. Where do you see the evolution of Kveik brewing going in the future? And what's your favorite Kveik beer?
The favorite Kveik beer. That's a tough one. I did think about this, and
it's hard to beat the really hoppy ones, the really juicy hoppy ones, in my opinion.
Right. I mean, I love a good hoppy beer. There's a couple different factors that go into choosing the best beer for me. Not only is it the taste and flavor of the beer itself, but, it's the company you're sharing the beer with and then the atmosphere where you're at. So if I was going to pick a favorite Kveik beer, it would have to be one that I haven't had yet on a, Western Norway farmhouse. That would be my favorite one, and I have yet to have it. So I'm looking forward to that.
Good answer. Good answer.
Thank you. And what was the first part of the question there?
Where's the future? You talked about it a little bit, but where's the future of all this going to?
Well, I think the future of it is obviously unwritten, and I think a lot of it depends on the home brewers and the craft brewers here and what they want to get from it. I know we are doing research here actively on some Kveik strains, so I don't know if anyone asked what my favorite Kveik strain would be, but we've got some hybrids going on, and number 1C is looking pretty good as far as my favorite strain goes. So that might be the future. Who knows?
And what makes it your favorite? What are the characteristics?
It's it's a very unique strain. I love personally. It's fun to watch it ferment. It does take off kind of like a freight train, and the flocculation patterns are just marvelous to look at. And it tastes really great. So love to tell you guys more about that in the future as it evolves.
No spoilers.
Just teasers.
Our friend Peter Simons says which strains would be recommended for an English ale profile. So is the is the are the characteristics of the Kveik, do they go against the sort of traditional sort of fruity estery kind of English characteristics?
Mm, I that's a really tough one to answer. If you're asking what strain I'd recommend for an English, I would pick or A09 Pub or maybe A10 Darkness. The one of the best things about an English beer is that you're going to have esteries, but it's not going to be too overpowering. And one thing about the Kveiks is that they have a fruit-like aroma, but it's kind of tropical.
Mm-hmm.
So it really wouldn't fit the style. I mean, I think that it would produce a good and interesting beer if you tried it. Loki would be a good one to try. Or A44 Viking, which is a blend, would be a great one to try. And then whenever new strains that we have come out, I would definitely try those. But as far as fitting the style goes, I would stick with the traditional English.
Have y'all tried to do any blends with Kveik strains and traditional Saccharomyces strains to see what would happen, or would Kveik just outcompete the more traditional ones?
Uh, we haven't done any blends that way. We have, like I said, we do have the Viking, which is a blend of three different ones, but I don't know if it would outcompete it or not. I think maybe they would accentuate each other. Let's say if you put, I don't know, let's say A38 juice with maybe Loki. I think that would be very interesting. And if anyone out there tries that, let me know. We have some ideas about that that are kind of under wraps right now. But if anyone out there tries that and produces something they like, let me know.
I guess the thing to think about that with that is if you do ferment at a higher temperature, maybe the juice wouldn't like that, and maybe might put out some off flavors that that would be undesirable. So it seems like
the potential's there for that. So it's interesting because most of these Kveik strains, when we get them from a farmhouse, they do have 2 to 10 strains within them. So it would be interesting.
And one last question that I meant to ask earlier: why did it take so long to catch on in North America? This has been these farmhouse brewers have been using this stuff for probably hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm.
Why did it take so long for it to get our attention? Did it take someone like Lars Marius Garshol to start doing writing and blogging on this stuff to really bring it to the world's attention?
I think it does, and I think that there's it's very similar to an earlier question asked about if there's still uncaptured yeast out there in nature or maybe in some of these other farmhouses, and I think that there are. One of the things that kind of puts this in perspective is if you think about the history of brewing. Farmhouse brewing was kind of, I guess, as beer became more modern, it was kind of looked at as kind of like older people in the woods kind of brewing, something that wasn't as shelf stable as what it is. But as far as, and that kind of added to the loss of some of these strains that could have been out there. And so it's kind of a bottleneck event in that sense. But going back to the very first time of the way that yeast was kept and reused is the first way that we kind of kept cultures and learned how to brew beer was using a favorite vessel, to ferment in. Maybe they didn't clean it all the way and it still had residual yeast in there. The second way, I guess the second event that happened is we found brewers, and I use the collective royal we here. We added like actively fermenting brew or brew from a batch that was good into one that hadn't been fermented yet. And the third way that we kind of evolved as far as keeping yeast goes was with Hansen, and that was he diluted some of that brew that was successful into getting a single strain, and that's where our pure yeast cultures come from. Is from this way of keeping yeast today. And so whenever this happened, everyone saw this as reliable fermentation. And so the people doing it the older way were kind of seen as, I guess, maybe too traditional and maybe not modern. So, and actually where we are now is, and if I'm looking at now in the future, in my perspective, I think that we're in the fourth stage. So right now we're understanding the phylogenetics and how these yeast strains that we've kept over time, how they're related and what they do. And, we're going to start doing, selective breeding. And in a way that you think about this is, sometimes I like to think about our strain catalog as sort of like, dogs, like the AKC. They have certain breeds and certain breeds are good at certain things. And, that's kind of the same way I think about yeast at certain times.
So has Imperial thought about sticking the toe into the world of genetic modification?
We have the capabilities to do that. I'm not sure if our clients really want that. But we like to stay informed on the topic, and we're happy to talk about the different ways that people are doing it today. But as far as right now goes, we're not doing any GMO. We kind of focus on growing things organically and using the best ingredients and sticking with cultures that are the best.
Well, there you go. Well, Matt, I appreciate your time. This has been a lot of fun, and I know that there are a whole lot of other questions out there that maybe people will have after they hear this episode. And I hope that you'll keep us in the loop on other fun and interesting things to talk about in the future.
Absolutely, and I'd be happy to come back and answer any questions. So, James, I appreciate your time and having me on the show, and to all the listeners out there, looking forward to seeing what the homebrewers bring up next.
Well, thanks again to Matt and to everybody out there who submitted questions. Such a fascinating topic, and it's incredible how quickly these Kveik strains have gained a foothold in the imagination of brewers around the world. And I'm planning another batch soon, while the summer heat is still around. Never thought I would look forward to summertime for any reason, other than just standing in a lake somewhere, holding a beer. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com. I don't like heat. I don't like to be hot. Or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com, and please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Check out our mobile-friendly shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody supporting us through our Patreon page. Special goodies coming your way. Check that out at patreon.com/basicbrewing. I don't like to be real cold either. Spring or fall, that's me. That's all until next time. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dotson. I know that's a controversial stance to take, anti-real hot or anti-real cold. But I'm both. I'm out there. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. In the meantime, stay well, be careful, and stay tuned. So long.